Mona, over to you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Jania, for your presentation and for the word, Alex. I have a PowerPoint which I will share with you. Today I will talk about constructive resistance, and I will exemplify with the Me Too movement in Japan, where I've done several field works during the last years. I think that there's been a trend to discuss resistance mainly as a sense of opposition, using words as a contradiction, social change, reject, rupture, damage, and so on and so forth. And I would say that this kind of resistance, the oppositional resistance that is mostly addressed when we discuss resistance, has previously been named by my research group as anti-repressive resistance or breaking resistance. We would say that breaking resistance is not resistance that avoids power relations. Rather, it's public resistance that deals with non-cooperation, disobedience, interventions, strikes, protests, and other kind of actions. We could also, if we look at the whole field of resistance studies, I would argue that we can see two major subfields. Of course, there are other research doing outside these fields, but major subfields that somehow divide the field into two. And that would be first that there's a lot of research on different kinds of organized resistance, social movement, contentious politics, and so on and so forth. And then on the other hand, we have a whole bunch of research that deals with individual and hidden resistance, which is termed everyday resistance or local agency, for example, if you go to the IR field. My research group, the Resist Research Group, which is composed by, for example, Stella Windhagen, Mikkel Batze, and Mikkel Schultz, we have spent some years just to think about the categorization of resistance, and we think that we must add to previous research with discussing, elaborating on the constructive mood of resistance. So that is what I will kind of dig into now, and thereafter exemplify with some insights from the Me Too movement in Japan. I mean, there are, of course, scholars that have done that to a certain degree. If we go to organization science, we can see that there are some, not much, but a little elaborations on how resistance is productive in working spaces. There's also the concept of prefigurative politics, which we argue in line with Minno Kofod that this strand doesn't really look into power and reactions to power, that is resistance, and it's also very focused on movements. And thirdly, there has been some research on meaning making as productive resistance. So if we look overall, we can see that there is some research that have been done on movements and institutions and the building of alternative institutions. For example, lately Minno Kofod has made some studies on the Kurdish movement and how they have established schools, own hospitals as a kind of constructive resistance. And we have also the research on individuals' resistance in organizations and how they produce new norms and change patterns, actions, practices within different institutions. And then finally we have then the meaning-making resistance. And here we can find post-colonial, decolonial researchers, for example, Lily Ling, or in IR, Roland Blaker, who's discussed how resistance work in discursive ways, and that might be the most important kind of resistance. And of course, we have some of Foucault's texts which deals with this kind of building the alternative of discourses. So we already have some research on constructive resistance that we need to bring out, elaborate further on, develop, and so on. So Resistance is then, to summarize, not only protest or disobedience, but also come to construct institutions, identities, discourses, communities, practices. And we have followed Kufo's definition of constructive resistance, and she argues that it is a response that might undermine power, and in its enactment of and performance and construction of alternatives. So alternatives is a key concept, building alternatives. That is a key concept in the field of constructive resistance. And so let us go to the Me Too movement. I assume that you all know that the Me Too campaign started in the US in 2017. And it's an example of a campaign that spread as people repeated it again and again and again. So it is to be viewed as a kind of a contagious form of resistance that just move on and multiply. And it also connected people that hadn't been connected previously through this kind of repetition of repeating, the practice of repeating. And it also constructed who was to be regarded victims, and who is the victim, so to speak, and also who is the perpetrator, and in some sense a contributor to this, to a community of belonging. So I would like to argue that the Me Too movement globally could be seen as both a constructive form of resistance, but it also had non-constructive dimensions. So the constructive and the non-constructive in some senses have cooperated in this moment, or entangled or worked together to create this particular form of resistance that the Me Too is. When the Me Too discourse came to Japan, it was repeated, but less so than in other countries. Instead, the Me Too has inspired to a whole new movement consist of primarily young women in Japan who have repeated the discourse in different ways. And for example, organizations such as Voice of Japan, Spring, or Human Rights Now has taken the message, but then reformulated it in other words, terms, practices. For example, the Me Too has been complemented with two discourse. With you, that is the people who believe in the Me Too and support the Me Too movement. So it's an active, passive kind of form of resistance, which support the Me Too. Let's see if I can change this. Yeah. You can say that the Me Too movement in Japan happened in two interrelated steps. First, we have the discourse, the Me Too discourse that arrived in Japan. And then in the second step, this was reinterpreted. It took new forms, and it created new discourses, a new kind of leadership, new movements, new identity position to speak from. That hadn't been there before. So you can talk about the contextual decoding process that kind of reshaped the whole Me Too movement in Japan. Let's see. So the Me Too in Japan was productive then, about new discourses, but also new organizations, but also a new hashtag, the With You hashtag. Oh, sorry for that. Okay. Yeah, that was the summing up. So overall, I think that the Me Too movement composes a really, really interesting example that shows also why repetitions are so important when you talk about resistance. And how come that repetitions keep going on? How come that people repeat in resistance movements? For example, I would say that if you go to Deleuze, you can see that he argues that repetitions evoke patterns that you expect to continue. He says that if you say A, B, A, B, A, B, A, you expect a B to arrive. So in that sense, repetitions of political messages expect new repetitions of the same political messages. At the same time, so these repetitions establish norms, and the norms in themselves become a hotbed for new repeats of the same message. So I think that the whole repetitions become a mean of constructive resistance. Maybe one of, in campaigns as the Me Too, maybe one of the most important means that we need to dig into and analyze as a constructive, which constructs building blocks. Yeah, maybe I should end there. Thank you so much.